Yo, what's up everyone? Welcome back. Patrick here. Moving on to the next video, Microeconomics. We're now going to talk about government interference and more specifically how the government can interfere with demand and supply and that interaction in the market between consumers and producers. Before getting into how the government affects everything though, let's do a quick review of what we've covered so far. So let's say we're looking at a certain good or service. We've got the price of the good or service on the y-axis. We got the quantity on the x-axis, and we got a supply curve, we got a demand curve. And basically where that demand and supply curve are going to meet is going to be here, and this is called the market equilibrium. And this is the point where consumers and producers are in agreement, where that quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. Another expression sometimes that comes up is the market clears at this point here. And we talked about how at this point there's that equilibrium quantity, and we also talked about how there's that equilibrium price. Let's call it P. Now, we discuss also the two situations that can happen if the market is out of equilibrium. So one way that could happen is if the price of a good or service is above that equilibrium price. So let's call it P1. And if this happens here, if we drew a horizontal line, notice this would be the quantity demanded, and then over here would be the quantity supplied. Notice that the quantity supplied would be greater than the quantity demanded at this price. And when the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, it means that there's a surplus of that good or service in the market. And then the other situation is if the price of a good or service is below that equilibrium price. So let's say it's over here, let's call it P2. If this happens, then this here is going to be the quantity supplied. This here is going to be the quantity demanded if we drew that horizontal line. So the quantity demanded in this case is going to be greater than the quantity supplied. And when that happens, we're going to have a shortage of that good or service in the market. And we talked about how if one of these situations happens, how the market interacts more specifically. We went through a series of steps of how to get back to this market equilibrium here. Now, what we're going to cover in this video is how the government can interfere with this. So if there's no interference, if it's a free market, so little government interference, then the price of a good or service is always going to go towards that market equilibrium. It's going to follow those steps that we went over before for both of these cases. But sometimes the government can interfere with this and prevent this market equilibrium from happening. So for example, up here, they could set a barrier where the price of a good or service cannot go below this price. They'll set like a minimum price for a good or service. And more specifically, this here is called a price floor. Or the other way, they'll set a barrier right here. And they'll say that the price of a good or service cannot go above this price here. And this will be called a price ceiling. Now in this diagram here, it's a little counterintuitive. You would think price floor would be here, price ceiling would be up there. But when you actually look at the intuition, it makes sense. A price floor is the minimum price. So if a price floor is here, notice that that market equilibrium, it's not happening, right? The government is preventing that market equilibrium to happen. And if there's a price ceiling over here, which is a max price, that's why it's called a price ceiling, it would be over here, and that would prevent that market equilibrium from happening as well. Now let's look at the price floor more specifically. Let's discuss it in a little bit more detail, and then after we'll discuss the price ceiling. So the price floor, as I mentioned, is the minimum price set by the government on a good or service. And we mentioned how a price floor can sometimes prevent that market equilibrium from happening. Because if the price floor is here, notice the equilibrium price is going to be here. But if the price floor is set up here, then any price below that price floor set by the government is going to be illegal in the market. So why does the government do this? Why don't they just let the free market figure everything out? Well, the intention for a price floor specifically is to protect certain producers. And usually it's producers of an essential good or service. So a good example is farmers. So with farmers, they're providing an essential good or service for society. Everyone has to eat. So what happens is if there's no government interference and we leave it up to the free market, then farmers are going to sell their products at this price and then at this quantity. But the problem is at this price and at this quantity, a lot of them can't make a living. It's actually too low a volume and too low of a price for them to pay their expenses, for them to make a living. And so if it was left up to the free market, what would happen is a lot of farmers would just stop supplying. They would actually maybe even change industries because this industry wouldn't be worth it for them. They wouldn't be able to make a living. Okay, so I'm going to put that example here. So i.e. ensures farmers make a living. Okay, so for the government starts to interfere and say, no, we need you supplying this essential good or service, so we're going to set a price floor. We're going to set a minimum price that the market has to buy that good or service from you in order for you to continue producing, to continue supplying that essential good or service. But the problem is that notice over here, if the price floor is here, then notice that that quantity supplied is going to be greater than that quantity demanded. So as we mentioned, there's going to be a surplus. So the issue with this intention, as noble as it sounds, is that there's a surplus. That quantity supplied is going to be greater than that quantity demanded. And so more specifically, there's going to be a misallocation of resources. Now the question is, how does the market continue to operate here? Because we mentioned that if there's no interference, if it's a free market and there's a surplus, then there's going to be certain factors that bring it back to market equilibrium, right? The producers are going to have a surplus. They are going to have to get rid of that surplus. They're going to have to lower their price, and then consumers are going to buy more, et cetera, et cetera. We went over the steps. It's going to go back to this market equilibrium. So how does the market continue to operate here? Well, notice that here at this price, the farmers or the suppliers are producing this quantity. Let's call it Q1. But the consumers are not buying that quantity. They're only willing to buy this quantity, Q2. So how is that extra quantity being funded, right? Who's buying that extra quantity? And the question, this is still under the issue actually, and the answer for this is that the government funds the surplus. So the government actually ends up buying this extra quantity. But how do they do that? They do it through higher taxes. So the government funds the surplus through higher taxes. That's usually what is happening. And so with this misallocation of resources here, the government funds the surplus through higher taxes. So the farmers are getting that price and that quantity to ensure they continue making a living, even though it's a surplus. And the way they get the money is through higher taxes. So everyone in society, all the individuals end up taking a hit. So the free market, the buyers are only buying this quantity directly here, but then the government forces everyone to buy this extra quantity here indirectly, and they do it through those higher taxes. Now, the last thing I want to mention about a price floor, I'm going to erase this part here, is that a price floor, it doesn't necessarily prevent market equilibrium from happening. So there's actually two cases that can happen. So the first case is the case that we've been discussing mostly, is if the price floor is greater than that equilibrium price. So if that price floor, so it's shown here, if that price floor is greater than that equilibrium price, so this is the price floor here, let's call it P1, then what happens here is that the market equilibrium is not possible. We can't go below that price. So market equilibrium is not possible here. So market equilibrium is not possible. It's prevented. And more specifically, there's going to be a surplus. However, what can also happen, we didn't really discuss this case, is that the price floor can be less than or equal to the equilibrium price. And if you think about it, if this happens, then that market equilibrium is possible. So you got to be careful on a midterm or exam if you get a question and they give you specific values. If that price floor is less than or equal to the equilibrium price, then that market equilibrium is possible, right? And there might be an answer where it's saying that there's a surplus. And just because you're seeing the word price floor doesn't necessarily mean that there is going to be a surplus. So more specifically on this diagram, let me erase this, kind of a lot going on here. So we got the supply, we got the demand. Here's the market equilibrium. Well, notice if the price floor is set less than that equilibrium price, the equilibrium price is here. Let's say the price floor is set right there. Well, notice price floor is the minimum price. And notice that that equilibrium price is going to be above that minimum price, above that price floor. And so it's going to be legal in the market. And so the market is just naturally going to go towards that market equilibrium. Or if that price floor is equal to that equilibrium price, then it's just going to stay there, right? So if this case is happening, then that market equilibrium is possible, and more specifically because that equilibrium price is going to be legal in the market. But if this is happening, if that price floor is above that equilibrium price, then the equilibrium price is illegal in the market. Market equilibrium is not possible, and then there's going to be a surplus. So just be careful with these two different cases. So now let's talk about a price ceiling. And a price ceiling, as we mentioned at the beginning, is a maximum price set by the government on a good or service. And we talked about how a price ceiling, if it's below that equilibrium price, which is here, then it could prevent that market equilibrium from happening, because if the price ceiling is here, any price above that, it's going to be illegal in the market. And the reason why a government would set a price ceiling, the intention is to protect consumers, right? So a price floor, the intention is to protect producers. A price ceiling is the other side. The intention is to protect consumers. Now, why is that? Because there are certain essential goods or services that a consumer needs that if it's left up to the free market, the price is going to be too high for a lot of consumers to be able to afford it. So if there's no interference, then notice that the price is going to be up here. And let's say we're talking about rent somewhere, which is an essential good or service somewhere where people need to live. Sometimes there's price ceilings, a lot of times there's price ceilings set on rent, because if it was left up to the free market, then a lot of people wouldn't be able to afford the rent and they wouldn't have anywhere to live. So that's an example. Let's write that, i.e. make rent affordable. Okay, but the issue is that if that price ceiling is set below that equilibrium price, notice that this here is going to be the quantity supplied, while this here is going to be the quantity demanded. So if the government sets a max price over here at P1, well, the suppliers are not going to be motivated to supply more than this amount, this QS here, but there's going to be this demand, this QD. So that quantity demand is going to be greater than that quantity supplied. So what's going to happen is that there's going to be a shortage. And so now the issue is the government has to figure out how to distribute that limited supply to the consumers. Government has to figure out how to distribute the limited supply. So how would they distribute it? Would it be a first come, first serve basis? Would it be that everyone gets the same quantity of that specific good or service? Or would it be in proportion to something, maybe proportion to income? It's hard to tell, right? I guess it would depend on the good or service, but the government would have to figure that out. How do they distribute that limited supply to that excess demand here? And sometimes you'll see this called in textbooks the rationing problem or the rationing issue, right? That distribution of that limited supply has to be figured out. Now, as I mentioned with a price floor, a price ceiling doesn't necessarily prevent market equilibrium from happening. So if that price ceiling is less than the market equilibrium, then, like in this case here, that market equilibrium is not possible. And more specifically, because there's going to be a shortage. That quantity demand is going to be greater than that quantity supplied. However, if the price ceiling is greater than or equal to market equilibrium, or this should be, equilibrium price. My bad. So yeah, if it's greater than or equal to the equilibrium price, then that market equilibrium is possible. Because the equilibrium price is going to be a legal price in the market. If the price ceiling is up here, remember a price ceiling is the maximum price set for a good or service, then that equilibrium price is going to be below that maximum price. So in this case, it's going to be legal, so that equilibrium, market equilibrium is possible. However, if the price ceiling is below the equilibrium price, like here, then that equilibrium price is going to be illegal in the market. So the market equilibrium in that case won't be possible, and more specifically because there will be a shortage.